these debates were huge, and they would have hundreds at times of unaffiliated university students come to these debates. And so the clubs were almost facilitators of a wider student experience.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Dowman. On the 19th of September, the Melbourne University Liberal Club celebrated its centenary. It was founded in 1925, the very same year as the Labor Club and Farrago. From the start, it was forged in debate. John Monash warned against student clubs affiliating with political parties, while John Latham, later Chief Justice, insisted they remain independent. Out of that principle, MULC, Melbourne University Liberal Club, was born, with its very first contest, a fiery debate against the Labor Club on the deportation of militant union leaders. MULC's history has mirrored the fortunes of liberalism in Australia itself. Declared dead and buried by Farrago in 1928, it re-emerged in 1943 as the Conservative Club before adopting the Liberal name in 1945. And this was just as Robert Menzies was launching his own Liberal revival. Figures like Alan Misson, David Kemp and Robert Clark all cut their teeth in its ranks. And over the decades, the club has debated all manner of important issues from communism, conscription, Whitlam, Israel, Vietnam. Sometimes standing shoulder to shoulder with the Liberal Party and other times challenging it from within. What is striking is its resilience, 100 years of it. Through all these years, through factional fights and student apathy, MULC has endured. It has remained a breeding ground for future leaders, a training ground for civic engagement, and above all, a forum where ideas can be tested, contested and sharpened. So to explore this story, I'm joined by Kai Bowie, the current president of the Melbourne University Liberal Club. Kai is just finishing his commerce degree. He's been a Hanson Scholar, so a very good student. He's an Army Reserve officer cadet and has worked alongside state members of Parliament as well. Kai, welcome to Afternoon Light.
Thank you, Georgina. That's a most generous introduction.
Oh no, it's well deserved. To be a Hanson Scholar is no mean feat, and to be president of MULC, I'm sure, is no mean feat.
Yes, well, it can be tricky at these AGMs, but we try and get it sorted. But it's certainly a great honour to be president in this 100th year.
It is incredible to think that this Liberal Club, a political club affiliated with the University of Melbourne, has reached its 100th anniversary. That does, as I said in my introduction, show an amazing resilience against, let's be honest, some pretty big odds. Student politics tends not to lean right at all.
Definitely not.
Personally, what attracted you to joining MULC?
Well, I didn't really know about the club before coming to university, but on my first day of O Week found the Liberal stall, and I went up to the current president at the time and said, "What do you do?" And he said, "We debate and then we go to the pub." And I thought, well, at least half of that sounds attractive. And then from there, of course, really fell in love with it. And I think as I've gone through uni, the thing that struck me most is how unique that is. It seems like a rather simple concept, especially the debate part, but that truly free debate and that encouragement of people clashing with their views and being quite open about it is surprisingly rare, I've found. And so in my third year at the club, and as I'm almost about to finish, unfortunately, I've only grown to sort of appreciate it more at that time.
I think that's a really important point, the lack of forums for debate on university campuses, and I think more broadly in our society. We are hosting Toby Young, who founded the Free Speech Union in the UK, and it has splinter groups around the Anglosphere, basically. And one of his, I think, genuine concerns is that we've lost the ability to disagree constructively.
Yes.
I mean, you don't have to disagree politely. I mean, that's probably setting the bar a bit high perhaps, but at least to just have a democratic culture where it's okay to disagree. You say apples and I say oranges, and, we can clash and argue the benefits of either, and, at the end we can move on and go to the pub.
Can coexist, yes. And that's an important part. It's almost like therapy afterwards, sort of conciliation at the end. And although often the debate does continue on into the pub, I will say that we need to be able to disagree peacefully and respectfully, but we also need to be able to have enough humility to be willing to change our views should the other argument have merit. And I think that especially has been lost in at least discourse on campus, which is all I can really profess to be any sort of expert on. And at the MOLC, that's something we really strive to do, in that if someone gets up there and does make an illogical argument or does sort of draw a demonstrably false conclusion, that it's not too much of a tribulation for that person to sort of go, okay, I was wrong on that, and then change. So we sort of really encourage that level of humility. And I think that is something we also focus on, because we want people to mature through the club and not just get good at debating their preconceived ideas.
I mean, it's interesting. I've got 2 children, last year of primary school, second year of high school, and they're both into debating, which probably comes as
doesn't surprise me.
Yes, to people who know me. But we were talking about, having to argue.
Yes.
In favour of something you actually really, truly disagree with. My son said, I couldn't do that. I said, that is absolutely what debating is about, arguing the case for something you disagree with. But, seeing how there are some merits to that argument, and, okay, you don't have to be convinced by them, but the
That's
whole
a great
art
exercise.
of it is a great exercise, and putting yourself in another person's shoes. We digress, though. Tell me about the founding of MOLC 100 years ago. What was happening here on campus in 1925 that caused this now storied Liberal Club to be created?
Yes, well, as you reflected on in introduction, 1925 was quite a political time for the campus, because it wasn't just the founding of the Liberal Club. You also had the Labor Club, which of course was a much stronger institution, politically speaking. There was no Liberal Party, and it certainly wasn't a dominant sort of liberal ideology, I would say, at the time, in the way that there was organised labour. And you also had the founding of Farrago, which, as much as it may deny it, is a deeply political paper, and that's fine. And
can you explain to our audience, who aren't all Melbourne University alumni, I can tell you what Farrago is?
So Farrago is a student paper, and it releases a number of volumes every year, and it's totally run by the students. So student editors, writers, researchers, whatnot. And it generally talks about issues on campus, as you'd expected, but often takes quite opinionated takes, I suppose, on the big issues, and so has been historically a rather political magazine, I suppose you would call it. And so on campus, you have the student union, which is almost in student politics, is inherently left-wing, and you have political clubs that have the backbone of well-organised political parties, and then you have Farrago. And so the Liberal Club comes in the midst of all that, and sort of as all that was being developed as an alternative, always an underdog, but a very self-confident alternative. That is one thing that has remained true over 100 years. Yes, us being sort of self-confident, but also always being the underdog.
Now, the Melbourne University Council at the time had very eminent people like General Sir John Monash and the person who would become Chief Justice, John Latham, on it. And both of them approved the establishment of political clubs, so the Labor Club, but also the Liberal Club. But they were opposed to political party affiliation. Now, as you say, the Liberal Party didn't exist until 1944, but you would have had the Nationalists, for example, that you could have aligned with. Labor Club could have aligned with the Labor Party, but they were precluded from doing so. Do you understand why Sir John Monash and Justice Latham were so concerned about affiliations with political parties?
And I actually quite agree with them at that time and their thoughts, because the politicisation of campus is something that is very problematic, especially when it's related to professional politics, because that leads, I suppose, well, one, I think it totally stifles free debate, because people immediately become beholden to these parties. It almost becomes a sort of funnel. You start in student politics and you become involved with the party apparatus, and sort of from 18, 19, you're already being indoctrinated, I suppose, in that way. And two, I think universities shouldn't be party political places. They should be places where political problems, as all problems sort of eventually are, should be discussed, but creating a partisan environment is quite different, and I think often does stifle debate. And as I say, and Molk is very proudly independent from the party. Of course, there are many similarities, but we are ultimately independent. Molk's purpose and the Liberal Party's purpose are very different. Liberal Party's purpose is to govern Australia. And so in some ways that restricts the public debate and the disagreement that you can have, because you have to have a certain level of unity. Molk has got a bit more freedom of movement there. And I'm not sure whether those great minds on University Council were thinking that much in that respect to the long-term health of the clubs, but certainly sort of preventing partisan politics from overtaking universities is something I think is very important and unfortunately has failed in some ways, and that is present.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. These political clubs aren't formally associated with the political parties, that they are somewhat liberated then from the constraints that a political party would place upon them, and this enables the development of ideas and debates and exchanges and perhaps talking about things that the political party wouldn't deem appropriate or in its interests. Do you see though, for example, here on campus these days you see the Victorian Socialists are very active, connected with the Students for Palestine group.
Yes.
That is an overt, I think, coming together of a political party with a student club. How does that impact, I think, campus life and your ability to debate if you have a political party quite obviously active on campus?
Oh, it makes it very difficult, I think. And for example, something that I've always wanted to do this year is to have a large public debate on campus with anyone from the left. And so we wrote to, and we'll link this into an example, we wrote to people from the Victorian Socialists or, Students for Palestine. We wrote to many of the Socialist and Labor affiliated clubs. And the mind does boggle. We had no interest whatsoever from the many dozens of emails that we sent to have a public debate, to the point where I went to someone from the Victorian Socialists and said, you can pick the time, the place, the topic, the format, whatever you want. I have one request, and that it be public, and that is it. And yet there was no interest. And I think...
And was there a reason why there was no interest?
No. Their reasoning was that they weren't interested, I suppose. But I think underlying that is probably there is a bit of sort of party training, and especially with Victorian Socialists who have gotten in trouble in the past for being a bit unruly, especially on polling days. I think it's likely they're told, don't expose yourself to unnecessary reputational risks, and they would
Which, of course, was the concerns, as you said, of Sir John Monash and Justice Latham, that these political parties would be putting all this pressure on these students and their political clubs. We can get to it later, but of course, very recently, political activist Charlie Kirk in the United States was murdered, it would appear, for the views he held, and also the influence he attracted through going to university campuses and debating topical issues with students. It strikes me that that's absolutely fundamental to democratic life and free speech, is to be able to have those debates about punchy issues. Debate fruit, dogs or whatever, even Liberal versus Labor, but those really, core issues, say trans rights, which obviously is very inflammatory, anywhere, but particularly the United States. The Voice a few years ago, Israel, Palestine, these are tough issues, but isn't a university campus the ideal place to have these debates with students who are still deciding what they think?
Well, if you can't debate it here, then where can you?
Yeah, but you can't debate it here.
But you can't debate it here, and then you can't debate it anywhere, it seems.
So
at least
tragedy.
Not without with some social repercussions.
But there were debates, Kai, weren't there?
Yes.
Because Molk and the Labor Club did have a debate over the deportation of Seamen's Union agitators.
Yes. It's such a fascinating time because in the early days, the memberships of both clubs were exceedingly small. In fact, we have recordings of meeting minutes where there might have been only 7 or 8 people from the Liberal Club in that meeting. But these debates were huge, and they would have hundreds at times of unaffiliated university students come to these debates. And so the clubs were almost facilitators of a wider student experience, as opposed to, increasingly now they exist for their own insular purpose, and we grow by getting more members as opposed to putting on public events. And so I find that absolutely fascinating, and I'm a bit jealous, to be honest, because it seems almost sort of like a golden era. But yes, very, very different time, these very large-scale public debates, and they would pick very thorny issues too.
I understand the first official speaker at this debate was a person who had become Robert Menzies' political ally and a future minister in the Menzies government, Wilfred Kent Hughes.
Yes.
And I think the Liberal Club won the debate. Is that right?
It's certainly what it says in our history. But if you get a Labor Club historian in this chair, they might dispute that.
Oh, I see. Right. So it's contested. There's a debate around the result of the debate. At the time, Farrago was really surprised that Molk lasted the year. It predicted the swift demise of Molk. Why do you think that Molk was able to last that first year? Was it something about the personalities who were involved?
Oh, I think there were some great personalities at that time. But I also think a bit more of a philosophical level. I think sort of most students certainly do have a lot of empathy for liberal values. They might not call themselves liberals, but certainly, and I think at the time it's quite a radical, progressive ideology at its core. And I think Molk certainly would at least stimulate enough interest to have these events and to have people come over, if not quite become members. And so all they needed was a small group of dedicated people. So it's quite a sort of versatile and survivable. What
I find really interesting is that Molk was called Molk, the Liberal Club, not the Nationalist Club at its inception. So the Liberal Party didn't exist. There had been Liberal parties, the Liberal Fusion, and Alfred Deakin had the Liberal Party. But at that particular stage, fought World War One. The Nationalists had been a party set up to, defend Australia, to fight for empire. And so there was a disconnect between political parties, which of course was the intention, but even in the naming. And so having a recognisable name that translated to the political sphere wasn't obviously the intention of the founders. Can you explain a bit more context to that?
Yes, so it's unfortunately not much survives on their thoughts behind that, but certainly having spoken to David Kemp, who was president in 1963, I believe, and maybe another year beyond that as well, and people who were a little bit close to that era, although David might get crossed if I say it was close to 1925, it seems that from the absolute outset, Molk was very determined to be a club that promoted a reasonably specific ideology, and that being liberalism, and that being sort of the liberalism of Adam Smith and Locke and the Mills. And they were quite worried that to become overly affiliated with a political party would make you beholden to the doctrine of that political party. And I think, I would hazard a guess and say most of the Molkers would have been supporters of the Nationalist Party at the time. But perhaps they saw that being sufficiently differentiated so that you could justify having some disagreements, and perhaps that sort of improvement from within, as you call it, was much more valuable than being directly associated with them. And so I suspect that was what was behind it, sort of wanted a bit more breadth to open debate and perhaps open to more members as well.
But then, of course, Farrago announces in 1928 that Molk had died.
Yes.
It was no more. But it then re-emerges as the Conservative Club. So it does change its name. I mean, again, not to identify with a political party.
Yes.
At the time, there's never, to my knowledge, been a Conservative Party in Australia, a party called the Conservative Party. So what was the thinking around the emergence of a Conservative club?
Well, certainly there was a lack of a sort of centre-right or right-wing student political party at the time. And so it seems that I believe that was 1943, around that time, that the Conservative Club came into existence. It seems the predominant voices at that time did see themselves as conservatives, perhaps in the British sort of style of the Tories, and that was a name they thought would give them the most energy to restart it and bring in members. But of course, it was rather short-lived, and only a couple of years later was back to the Liberal Club, this time, of course, with the Liberal Party having been formed. And so whether or not the change from the Conservative Club to the Liberal Club was because they wanted to hark back to the olden days of 1925 to 28, or whether they wanted to get in step with Robert Menzies, I would suggest it was a happy coincidence and that both were positive factors in the change.
Menzies' Liberal revival in the 40s, the creation of the Liberal Party, and then the rebranding of Molk once again as the Liberal Club in 45 were some important evolutions. But after that, how did it survive on what was really becoming quite a left-wing campus? I mean, it's sort of always been fairly left-wing, but I think through the 50s and into the 60s, campus, the Vietnam War and those debates, it would have been very, very hard going for Molk, no doubt.
Oh, incredibly hard. And certainly we've had years, even in recent times, where it's been a real drought of members, and then in other years where we've done a bit better. And I think the club is always, and this is true for any organisation, you need some core members who are going to keep it alive. And we've been very lucky to essentially since 1945 have every year at least one or two people who can sort of carry the torch and keep it alive. But I think there is an enduring attraction that the club has for students because it is the only real alternative to this sort of huge breadth of left-wing ideologies and organisations on campus, whereas there's only one right-wing alternative with a few historical exceptions. And I think at other universities we see multiple, at Sydney, for example, there's the Sydney University Liberal Club, there's the Sydney University Conservative Club, and so there's that sort of internal conflict and competition. Whereas perhaps because Melbourne's so left-wing, there's only ever been room for one right-wing club, and that's allowed it to survive.
There are famous figures who come out of the Melbourne University Liberal Club. Alan Misson, of course, the senator. David Kemp, who's on the Robert Menzies Institute board but was a minister in the Howard government. Robert Clark, who ended up going into state parliament.
Yes.
And was, I think, Attorney General.
Attorney General, yes.
They're significant figures at a state or national level. Does it demonstrate the importance of Molk as that breeding ground for national leadership, do you think?
I think so. And I think more than that, it's a training ground for ideological leadership. And I think Alan Misson and, all of them are great examples, but certainly I know a lot about Alan Misson, David Kemp, Robert Clark in their own ways. And Alan Misson, very famously, and to some at least short-term discomfort for his career, sort of led the club against the banning of the Communist Party in that referendum. And that was, of course, totally against the orthodoxy of the Liberal Party and Robert Menzies himself at that time. And I think that's a seminal moment for the club and, of course, was for Alan, because if we weren't brave enough to have that debate and we just sort of fell into line for the Liberal Party at that time, I think the Molk loses a bit of its meaning. And so perhaps events like that have also, to sort of add on your previous question, have added to its survivability. And I think for Alan that would have been quite a transformative experience because a big risk, and he's naturally taken some reputational damage from much of the Liberal Party, and yet he's survived, he's done the right thing, and he went on to have a fantastic career in politics. And with David Kemp, David was one of the ideological, in terms of liberalism, thought leaders in the country. And when he was, I believe, the title wasn't Chief of Staff, essentially was whatever the role of Chief of Staff was for Malcolm Fraser at the time, actively tried to introduce the ideas of Hayek and the Austrian School of Economics, and perhaps our most, along with Friedman, our most modern incarnation of liberalism, and really tried to bring that to Fraser and take Australia to the next level of liberalism. And I think his experience as president of Molk was, I think, a large part of that. In fact, Molk were one of the first organisations to actively read and discuss Hayek in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think they're two fantastic examples, and as you say, the bravery of Alan Misson, leading the Liberal Club, taking the stand against Robert Menzies, the leader of the political party, the founder of the political party, in his push to ban the Communist Party, would have,
it took some guts.
Would have been a very brave thing to do, but paid off for him and paid off for the country in the end. What about in Vietnam, during the Vietnam War in the 60s, early 70s? How was the club going then?
Well, interestingly, it was both a tough time for the club, but I think ultimately allowed it to grow. Of course, nothing characterises the Vietnam War perhaps more than the student protests, and saw that in the US and certainly in Australia. People, especially young people, were very, very much against it on the whole. And on campus, that was the case to the extreme. And at the time, whilst there were disagreements, most of Molk were generally in support of the war and in support of Robert Menzies. And so it was essentially whether we were brave enough at the time to go against this tsunami of student displeasure with the Vietnam War and fight the counterpoint. And I think it would have been a very hostile time. It would have been a very uncomfortable time, but certainly would have really established Molk as a place that's not afraid to go against the grain. And there were some very big debates at the time that I'm told got quite intense on the Vietnam issue.
Yeah, I mean, Harold Holt, who was Prime Minister straight after Robert Menzies retires in 1966, he delivers the inaugural Alfred Deakin lecture. And, I mean, there are huge, and it was here, wasn't it?
Yes.
At University of Melbourne. I mean, there were huge protests against him. I think I've seen photos of some of
Yes.
they're pretty violent too. So there was a sense that campus was pretty hot in terms of debates
Incredibly.
around Vietnam, and the Liberal Club was standing by, at least the leader of the Liberal Party at that stage. He talked about David Kemp and his role working for Malcolm Fraser and introducing the economic liberalism ideas of Hayek and Friedman. In the 70s, the Liberal Party becomes quite divided, and there used to be this term, the wets and the
Yes.
dries. So the wets being sort of pro more government intervention in the economy, and I guess more sort of Keynesian economics, and the dries being the ones who wanted to liberalise
Yes.
trade,
Open
and
everything up.
markets, and deregulation and the like. I mean, the Liberal Club was part of those debates, and you've talked about, say, in Sydney, the Liberal Club and the Conservative Club kind of part company, and
Yes.
whereas at Melbourne University, the different ideological viewpoints can be contained within one club. How did the wets versus dries debate unfold for the Liberal Club in the 70s?
Well, that's the biggest difficulty of being the sole lasting centre-right club, because, of course, there's such a huge range of views within the right of politics. And, of course, the right of politics at the University of Melbourne, it's a very large group of ideological ideas because the left is so far to the left. And so the trick of the club, I think, has been able to prevent this divide of the wets and the dries, prevent that from becoming a factional issue, prevent that from becoming anything more than a division in ideas, and sort of prevent it from becoming a division of people, I suppose. And so at that time, and of course, I would say David Kemp, unfortunately, was ultimately unsuccessful in converting Malcolm Fraser towards that sort of Hayekian view of opening up Australia. But certainly within the club, we see that during that time there was relative stability. And of course, that was when around that time, Robert Clark was president of the club from 79 until 80. And he certainly recollects a club that was seemingly near the peak of its power. And, of course, would go on to actually sue the University of Melbourne quite famously. And so a club that can do that is obviously a club that's reasonably unified and working well. And I think even to this day, a large part of my job as president is having, this really is a broad church in the truest sense, club of ideas and students who might be moderate and might be quite far to the right, and making sure that there is a unity in common purpose and keeping that debate. And so I think that would have been especially difficult but important in the 70s when that wets versus dries debate was perhaps at its peak.
Yeah, so in the 70s it was about economics, and today this moderates versus conservatives factional divide, for want of a better term, is more about social, cultural issues. What then, as president of the Melbourne University Liberal Club, irrespective of whether you're a moderate or conservative, what do you think you all agree on that brings you together then?
I'd like to think we all agree on the fundamental principles of liberalism, of respecting the individual and the dignity of the individual, sort of believing in market mechanisms more than we don't believe it, certainly being against central planning. But to be honest, the Molk isn't here to run the country. And unfortunately, we're not even really going to be able to run the university, it seems, anymore, at least not maybe another 100 years. So these ideas about economic structures and tax and whatnot, they're certainly, we debate them. But the thing that underpins the club more practically is this idea that there should be a place where you can freely debate, and there should be a place where you can challenge orthodoxies. And I think with that in mind, there are probably members in the club who perhaps even vote Labor or perhaps even vote the Greens out of a sort of a strong environmental conscience and wouldn't think of voting for the Liberal Party, but they like the club because there is that openness and that freedom to discuss. And so I would say from an ideological point of view, that's probably the only common denominator. There's probably a majority of people who believe in some form of classical liberalism or sort of, Friedman-style economics, but it wouldn't be universal. And so there's sort of almost a higher purpose, I would say, if there could be a higher purpose in liberalism, in this free exchange of ideas, which is such a simple concept, so easily explainable and yet somehow so rare at this university.
Something that is sadly rare, I have found in the almost 5 years I've been doing this job, is a high level of literacy of Australian history.
Oh, yes.
And obviously here at the Institute, we work very hard to give young people an opportunity to learn more about Australian history in the contemporary era. Why do you think a knowledge of history is important as a young politically inclined person, Kai?
I think without understanding the context of the society we live in today, you can't really understand why the orthodoxies are the way they are and how they've been changed in the past. And if you don't know the assumptions that underpin the way we live, then how can you challenge them? I think it's all about perspective, I think. Reading through David Kemp's History of Australia, it's 5 volumes, it's quite long. But one, it's amazing how much I didn't know. But two, Australia is quite unique because as a, sort of post-colonial Australia is such a young society, you can realistically go from 1788 and roughly understand how our structures have developed and what the political debates have been. And so with that context, I think you can go to today in contemporary politics and perhaps, one, give a much more sort of reasoned analysis and observation of where we are, but also look at those historical trends and go, well, perhaps this is where we should be going because we've actually tried X, Y, Z. And I think that's especially true, for example, in Victoria. And a great example is the Victorian government bringing back the State Electricity Commission. One would not have to read that far back in history to see why that had started under none other than Sir John Monash, one of the great Australians, and then why it was eventually ended under Kennett. And I think if you don't have that context, which unfortunately many don't, then you find that people are recycling arguments unknowingly that have since been sort of refuted. And it really slows down the progress of the country because it's quite a waste to debate things that have sort of already been settled, I find. And that's, yes, to give that example, I think it's especially true with the State Electricity Commission.
Yeah, I think debates, say, around immigration, which is becoming a hot
Yes.
issue once again, whether you're for a big Australia or want a smaller Australia or something in the middle, a knowledge of history of how migration flows have evolved in Australia, of why we've sought out more migrants over the years and why we've tempered them at some points, the types of migrants who've come to Australia, what they have contributed to Australia, how Australia has accommodated large numbers of migrants while maintaining very high levels of social cohesion and still maintaining a sort of sense of Australian identity. I think without a knowledge of history, having a really informed debate is basically impossible.
Yes, no, I agree. And, immigration's a great example because I don't think there's anything new in our current debate of immigration in terms of it's all been discussed before. And, the history it's so fascinating. You can go back during the gold rush, we had these country towns now that are rather small, and they were so large and had so many immigrants. In fact, had Chinatowns in some of our regional Victorian towns. And to think that this idea of mass immigration and this debate is sort of a new contemporary issue, it's totally ignorant of the past. And I think we could learn a lot, especially from Menzies, who sort of over his tenure dismantled the White Australia policy and that sort of development of Australia from this idea of a white European settlement to truly accepting our place in the Asia Pacific and making most of that and sort of getting out of our own way. There is a lot there. And I think someone who mastered that history could probably lead us into the future quite well because we've all been there before. We've been there before and it's the same.
Robert Menzies is obviously a very important figure for Liberals and also for Melbourne University Liberals. Yes. He's a student here from 1913 to 18. He, after leaving politics, becomes Chancellor of this university. He founds a number of political parties, actually, but the Liberal Party is the enduring one. What does Robert Menzies mean to a Melbourne University Liberal Club member in 2025?
I think Robert Menzies, in this year, 2025, when the Liberal ideology is really under fire across the country and, after a shocking election and not much faith in the state party at the moment, I think Robert Menzies' comeback and his vision to create the Liberal Party and these ideas of the forgotten people and these ideas of enabling the individual in a country that was sort of stifled by protectionism and fixed wages and whatnot, I think that is very inspirational for current Mulkers because, I'm not going to try and predict the future, but I suspect some sort of revolution in that way is perhaps once again needed for this ideology. And certainly as young, sort of excitable people, we tend to think that. And in that way, his vision and his leadership to actually start a movement is something that we really look up to. And then, of course, throughout time, not just now, but even when the Liberal Party has been at the height of its powers, I think his ideology, and there's a certain almost pureness to it, and certainly intellectual curiosity, as you see through his writings and even his poetry and whatnot, and that type of statesman, I think is timelessly attractive and of interest to Mulkers, because I think political power is not the end goal. There's a way of carrying yourself and a way of caring about the country and this sort of good-hearted patriotism that Robert Menzies had that, unfortunately we don't see in many politicians today. And I think that's an enduring point of interest for Mulkers, and I suspect we'll be around in another 100 years.
That's fantastic, Kai. Well, thank you so much for coming on Afternoon Light.
No, thank you.
Congratulations to Mulk on its 100th birthday. It's a great achievement, and all the best for the next 100 years.
Thank you, Georgina. I really appreciate it.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.